One of the outputs, I think, influenced by the shadow woodlands concepts. So I published my first proper book on this in 2017. That had quite an impact. And I think one of the consequences was raising people's awareness of what we now call the Atlantic rainforests and the temperate rainforests. Now, this actually goes back to work particularly by a colleague in Cumbria called Peter Quelch. He worked in southern Scotland and Cumbria, and some Scottish researchers, Sandy and Brian Coppins, who did fantastic work on the west coast oak, hazel, coppice woods. I mean, it's remarkable stuff, and I don't think it's been given sufficient recognition, because they were the ones who really started the thought about how special the Atlantic zone was. The Atlantic, what I call the Atlantic shadow, without wanting to confuse shadow woodlands, but it's a shadow across that western area which is really, really wet. The classic thing being, you know, that in the Lake District, if you can't see the fell, then it's raining. If you can see the fell, it's about to rain. It is very, very wet. And that means that even without trees, the woodland flowers still grow really well and they persist. And large areas of the Lake District, because of the height of the mountains, large areas are also in shadow, so they don't get the blistering hot sun in quite the same way as you might do in other areas. So we get these fantastic areas of Atlantic rainforest, temperate rainforest, and that's really captured people's imaginations. But one of the points I would make is that that actually extends much further east than I think presently people give credit for. And the reason is, I mean, we can use the same principle as before, looking at the plants and the shadow woods. So some of the plants, there's little moss, a tiny bryophyte, it looks like a little liverwort, called Hookeria, named after Hooke, the famous botanist and microscope person. Very, very sensitive to humidity. That does occur in a few spots in the Peak District. Nobody's really looked for it because it's a tiny little thing. But that's a marker of the eastern extent, if you like, of the temperate rainforest influence. We have the sexual reproductive part, the gametophyte of Killarney fern, very, very sensitive to humidity. Only occurs in certain areas where there's springs that run down through rocky outcrops and trickle down into tiny little cavelets in the rocky escarpments and places like that. And again, these are markers of the eastern boundary, I think, of the Atlantic rainforest shadow. And we get things like golden scale male fern and the hard shield fern and the soft shield fern and various other species are all part of that. Now, one reason people don't recognise the spread from the west to the east is because a lot of the woodlands down the spine of England, down the Pennines and the Peak District, etc., have suffered hugely in the last 200 to 300 years from air pollution, which is a Sheffielder I like to blame on Manchester. But basically sulphur dioxide and soot removed loads and loads of the lichens and the bryophytes and the ferns that would have populated those woods, and which make the Cumbrian rainforest so special. So things like common polypody growing on the trees, it's now coming back in the Peak District. The wonderful beard lichens, which you get along the west coast, absolutely fantastic things. They die out because of air pollution. They are now coming back. Oliver Gilbert, the late Oliver Gilbert, discovered them back in the 1980s, starting to reappear. We have records from the 1700s east of Sheffield to a fantastic oak woodland, which was described as being festooned with beard lichens. They are then removed by the air pollution from the local steelworks. So when we look at these sites, we have to bear in mind what human impact has done to them and factor that in. This is this business of understanding history to know how we got where we are and what the future potential is. Because with decrease of acid rain and soot pollution, these things are coming back. So I think we need to be more imaginative about that eastern extent. The ecological envelope, if you like, for rainforest gets much tighter as you come east because it's getting drier. And then you get further east into East Yorkshire, into Lincolnshire, Cambridgeshire, down into East Anglia, and it's a continental climate and it's very, very dry. So if you remove trees, then the woodland plants just shrivel up and die. You know, we know that. And that influenced the thought, I think, of people like George Peterkin, the ecologist and woodland historian, and Oliver Rackham, because they worked in those eastern areas. If you go to Cumbria, you can take the trees out and the woodland plants largely do really, really well. I can find shadow woods around Bassenthwaite marked by Herb Paris, which is a fantastic indicator plant. In the Peak District, we've got a handful of sites. In Cumbria, there are loads. So you have to think about context. I think the Cumbrian rainfall is somewhere getting on towards, I can't recall exactly, but maybe about 2,000 millimetres a year. Kinder Scout, I think we're on about 1,000 millimetres a year. So there's a difference. It's still very wet. I mean, Manchester is famously wet. So the Atlantic shadow extends further. And we need to think about that for the future because we have really exciting potential to allow a greater extent to this forest to recover, but also to engage a wider human community in that process because it will be on their doorsteps as well. It's not something that's kind of remote. It's like with rewilding, we need to think about engaging urban people much more effectively. And I think with the Atlantic woodlands, we can do that. You know, Great Britain is an Atlantic island, and we have a huge influence of that on our climate and our ecology. But we have to understand what history has done and what we've done.